The dry, scraping sound of wheels rolling against the concrete curb echoed beat by beat as if it were knocking directly against my heart. I am Marilyn Foster, 69 years old. That morning, I pushed my own wheelchair to my son's front door in Livingston, New Jersey. On my lap was a small suitcase, everything I had brought with me, and also the last bit of my pride, crumbling into pieces with every turn of the wheels. Damon opened the door. My son looked down at his mother sitting in a wheelchair, looked at the suitcase resting on my lap, and said exactly one sentence. Short, cold, without a hint of hesitation. "Mom, you can't stay here." In that moment, my heart felt like it shattered, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had just realized I no longer had a place in my own family. But the next morning, while I was rummaging through old drawers at home, I accidentally found one of Howard's old business cards, my husband's, wedged deep at the bottom of a drawer. And from that very second, everything began to veer in a completely different direction. Because just a few hours later, when I walked into the bank with that business card in my hand, the branch manager practically jumped out of his chair and hurried out to greet me, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. If you're wondering, what happened? Who was Howard really? And how could a single business card turn everything upside down? Then don't leave just yet. The next part will show you there are secrets kept hidden not to protect a family, but to wait for the right moment to expose the truth. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching this story from by leaving a comment below. And if you want to hear the whole story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because what's coming next will be anything but gentle. 8 months ago, I thought the biggest problem in my life was simply learning how to live on Social Security after Howard passed away. Looking back now, it feels almost laughable. Life always has its own way of mocking our naive assumptions. The accident happened on a Tuesday. For some reason, the collapsing moments in my life always seemed to choose Tuesday to show up. That day, I was walking home from the supermarket in Newark, my arms full of grocery bags. I hadn't used a cart, not because I didn't need one, but because I was too proud to do that, as if admitting I had grown weaker was something I simply could not accept. It started to rain. In Florida, wet sidewalks are as slippery as ice. But in Newark, New Jersey, it's much worse. Old bricks, sunken over the years, holding puddles of rainwater, just waiting for one bad step. 1 second I was walking, thinking about how to stretch this week's budget to buy the cookies Howard liked for the dinner I planned to have in his memory. The next second, I was on the ground. My hip felt like it had been torn apart. The grocery bags had flown everywhere across the parking lot. They looked like confetti at a funeral no one wanted to attend. The paramedic, a young man so fresh-faced he could have been my grandson, kept repeating, "Ma'am, try to stay calm, okay?" And I just lay there, calculating in my head how much this ambulance ride was going to cost. 3 surgeries, 4 months of physical rehabilitation. And here I am now, Marilyn Foster, 69 years old, former accountant, and currently a wheelchair specialist. The doctor said I could walk again if I had enough money for physical therapy. But physical therapy costs money. Money I do not have. Howard's life insurance was just enough to cover the funeral. And Social Security is not enough to create any kind of miracle. If you think the worst part of this story is the accident, then you still haven't seen the most painful part, because the accident only took away my ability to walk. What happened afterward took away the only place I thought I still belonged. The house we bought 30 years ago, when Damon was still in high school, had now become my prison. Everything was upstairs: the bedroom, the bathroom, and Howard's office, where he had spent countless hours on projects I never truly understood. For months, I slept on the couch in the living room, used a bedpan like a disabled invalid, could only bathe when my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had time to help me into her accessible bathroom with safety handles. Every night, I lay there staring up at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock. In my ears was the sound of my own breathing, steady but unbearably lonely. Do you know what the worst kind of loneliness is? It's not when there is no one beside you. It's when you realize that the one person who was supposed to be by your side has decided you are not worth it. My son Damon had visited exactly twice since the accident. The first time was 3 days after I was discharged from the hospital. He stayed for exactly 20 minutes, spending most of that time explaining how busy he was with work and the kids. His voice was polite, but his eyes kept flicking toward his watch. The second time was last month. He brought Celeste, his wife. Celeste sat there the whole time, her eyes never leaving her phone. Every so often she would sigh, then comment that everything in the house looked so gloomy. In the end, I did something I had always avoided. I swallowed all of my pride. Yesterday, I called Damon. "Damon, I need your help." I hated the way those words sounded. They sounded like begging. "What do you need help with?" His voice was careful, the kind of tone people use when they are already looking for a way out. "I can't live here anymore. Just temporarily, until I figure things out." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Mom, let me talk to Celeste." "I'll call you back." That was 18 hours ago, and there had been no call, so I did the one thing I never thought I would have to do. I packed a small suitcase, called a cab, and showed up at my son's front door, unannounced. If your own son refuses to help his disabled mother, then maybe, just seeing his mother there in the flesh would remind him what family really means. At least that's what I had hoped. Their house in Livingston looked like a monument to achievement. 3-car garage, a perfectly manicured lawn, the kind of house that, just by standing there, seemed to shout a single sentence: "We made it." My wheelchair, in that moment, suddenly felt as out of place as an abandoned supermarket cart in front of a Mercedes dealership. I rang the doorbell and waited. While I waited, I could hear the sounds of a fully functioning family life slipping through the thick walls. Children laughing and talking, Celeste's voice calling someone to dinner, the TV playing a familiar cooking show, a normal life, the kind of life that I used to have. The door opened. Damon stood there, khaki pants pressed to perfection, a polo shirt that looked like it cost an entire month of my food budget. The expression on his face when he saw me sitting in that wheelchair is something I will never forget. Not surprise, not worry, but irritation. Pure, undisguised irritation, as if I were a door-to-door salesperson who had accidentally interrupted his perfect Sunday afternoon. "What are you doing here, Mom?" "I came to visit the family." I tried to keep my voice steady. "And I'm asking you for help." But I could see it in his eyes immediately. I had made a mistake, a very big mistake. "Mom, you can't just show up here like this." Damon glanced over his shoulder. Over his shoulder, I saw Celeste standing in the hallway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a tight line, a posture that needed no words to say she did not approve. My grandchildren peeked around the corner, their eyes briefly curious as they looked at me, then were quickly shooed away. "I called you yesterday," I said, trying not to let the desperation leak into my voice. "I left a message, explaining everything." "Yeah, and I said I'd call you back." Damon stepped outside and closed the door behind him, as if my presence could somehow contaminate that perfect house. "This is not how we handle family matters, Mom. Family matters." As if helping his disabled mother was a business deal that needed an appointment and a board's approval. Do you know what hit me the hardest in that moment? It wasn't when Damon said I couldn't stay. It was the way he closed the door behind him. Slow, firm, like he was closing a chapter in a book he wanted to forget forever. Behind that expensive oak door was the kitchen I had put $20,000 toward so Damon could buy this house. Howard had cashed out his retirement early, paid the penalties, just because Damon needed a boost to start his life. For the next 2 years, my husband and I pinched every single penny, but it was fine, because our son was building his future, and now that future was standing right in front of me, telling me that I had no place in it. I can't live in the old house anymore, I tried to explain. Everything is upstairs. I can't climb the stairs. And you will get help. Damon's voice took on a protective tone, the kind of tone that made me want to scream. But you just showing up here unannounced is not the answer. Celeste planned dinner. The kids have homework. This house has a schedule. A schedule that clearly had no room for his mother. I'm not asking you to break your schedule, I said. I just need a place to sleep until I figure things out. A week, maybe 2. Damon's jaw clenched. You know how Celeste feels about unexpected changes in our household dynamics, Mom. Household dynamics. That's what I had become. An unexpected change in their household dynamics. Not the mother who had raised him. Not the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through college. Not the one who celebrated every one of his achievements like it was a national holiday. Just an inconvenient disruption to their perfect suburban schedule. You know you helped us buy this house. The sentence slipped out of my mouth before I could stop it, and I regretted it immediately, hearing the desperation in my own voice. That's different, Damon said quickly. That was a loan, and we paid it back. $20,000. Howard had cashed out his retirement early, accepted the penalties because Damon needed to get settled. They had paid back exactly $3,000, and then the payment stopped, and the subject became too awkward to bring up. Of course, I said, because what else could I say? The front door opened. Celeste appeared, hair perfectly highlighted, Sunday outfit immaculate. Everything about her only made me more aware of my own appearance. Sweatpants, an old shirt, and the desperate energy that clings to people who have run out of options. Marilyn, she smiled, a smile so fake it could have been bought at a dollar store. Hello, Celeste. Damon says you're having some challenges with your current living situation. Challenges. As if being disabled and broke were just minor inconveniences, like a leaky faucet or a noisy neighbor. I was hoping I could stay here for a few days, I said, while I get things sorted. Celeste's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Oh, sweetheart, you know we'd love to help, but you know the kids' schedule, soccer, piano, family commitments. We barely have time to breathe. Family commitments. I wondered if she realized the irony in that phrase. Besides, she went on, our living room is under renovation, has been for months. You know how contractors are always behind. I looked up at that house, all those windows, all those rooms, and I knew she was lying, but calling her out on it would only make things worse. Maybe we can help you find somewhere, Damon cut in. There are some pretty good assisted living facilities. Assisted living that costs $3,000 a month, I said bluntly. I get $800 from Social Security. There are programs, Celeste added, her tone full of goodwill. Government assistance. I'm sure you qualify for something. Something. Someone else's program. Someone else's money. Right then, sitting there in my wheelchair in front of my son's house, a memory suddenly came back to me. Damon at 7 years old, falling off his bike, scraped knee, running home in tears. I had held him tight, cleaned the wound, bandaged it, kissed his forehead and said, "You always have me, always." That little boy had believed me. The man standing in front of me now didn't need me anymore. Or rather, he needed me to disappear. I started rolling my wheelchair back down the driveway. My heart cracked a little more with every turn of the wheels. "Mom, don't be like that," Damon called after me. Be like what? Accurate? I get it, Damon, I said. Family is complicated. While I waited for the cab to come back, $40 I couldn't afford for a round trip, through the window, I could see them in the kitchen. Celeste gesturing non-stop, Damon nodding. They were probably discussing how to deal with the Marilyn problem without anyone having to feel guilty. The cab driver, a kind man from Haiti, helped me lift my suitcase into the car, not asking a single question when I gave him my address. On the way back to Newark, I looked out at the suburban neighborhoods where families were gathered around their Sunday dinners, and I wondered, when exactly had I become the kind of person other people couldn't wait to get rid of? That night, lying on the old sofa staring up at the ceiling, I finally realized something that should have been clear a very long time ago. I was completely alone. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only appears after you've hit rock bottom in spectacular fashion. My hip was throbbing, my pride was shattered, the balance in my bank account, $237, screaming for help in silence. But for the first time in months, my mind felt clear. I pushed my wheelchair into Howard's old office, a place I had barely dared to step into since his funeral 3 years ago. His desk was still there, his reading glasses, the coffee mug with a circular stain permanently etched into its surface. Stacks of paperwork I had never had the courage to sit down and sort properly. The smell of old paper, of wood, and a scent that could only be Howard's, a faint cologne, ink, the scent of a man who had spent his life in this room, working with numbers. I reached out and touched the surface of the desk. It was cold. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I could almost hear Howard so clearly it gave me chills. The clicking of the keyboard, the rustle of pages turning, his quiet sigh when he hit a difficult problem. "Why did you hide everything from me, Howard?" The question rose in my mind with no answer. Howard was the kind of man who was obsessively meticulous about a few things and completely messy about everything else. His filing system, if you could call it that, basically worked like this. Any important document got shoved into whichever drawer was closest at the time. I started with the top drawer, the 2019 tax return, warranty information for an oven we'd thrown out 2 years ago, restaurant receipts he had kept for reasons only he understood. Very Howard. The middle drawer wasn't any better. Old checkbooks, expired coupons, a collection of pens that had probably stopped working back in the Clinton era. But all the way in the back, wedged behind a stack of medical bill files, my fingers brushed against something that made me stop. A business card, thick stock, embossed lettering, the kind of card that radiated, "This is where money and power live." Harborline Private Finance, Discreet Wealth Management. Underneath was a name I had never heard before, Victor Sloan, Senior Private Banking Advisor. I flipped the card over. In Howard's small, cramped, familiar handwriting, there was a note. Account number HBL 9921MFR, Emergency Access Only. Emergency Access Only. If being disabled, broke, and nearly homeless didn't qualify as an emergency, then I didn't know what did. Howard and I had banked with Newark Community Bank for 35 years. Checking account, mortgage, a small savings account. Everything went through Linda, the friendly bank clerk who always remembered our names every time we walked in. Harborline Private Finance, on the other hand, sounded like a completely different universe, the kind of place for people with private jets and vacation homes in the Hamptons. In 43 years of marriage, I had never once heard Howard mention this name. Do you know what it feels like to realize that the person you thought you knew best in the world is actually a stranger? 43 years. For 43 years, I thought I knew who Howard Foster was, the man who clipped coupons, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic until the wheels were practically coming off, the man who always said, "Sweetheart, we don't need much. As long as we have each other, that's enough." And yet here I was, holding in my hands the business card of an elite private bank with the words "Emergency Access" written by my husband's own hand. Who was the real Howard? If you've ever thought you truly knew someone, your wife, your husband, your child, imagine one day discovering they'd been living a second life you knew nothing about. It's not just a financial shock, it's a shock to your trust, to the question, for 43 years, who have I really been living with? and I was about to find out the answer. Not from my husband, but from a stranger at a bank. The reasonable thing to do would probably have been call ahead, make an appointment, explain the situation over the phone like a normal person. But after the way I had been treated the day before, normal no longer existed in my vocabulary. I called a cab. Harbor Line Private Finance occupied the top 3 floors of the newest tower in downtown Newark, the kind of building with a marble-floored lobby and security guards who looked like they'd just stepped out of Secret Service recruitment posters. The directory in the lobby listed the tenants, wealth management firms, investment companies, and law offices with booming names like Morrison, Morrison and Associates, the kind of places where people's problems are solved with signatures on very expensive pieces of paper. The elevator to the 28th floor was the quietest I had ever ridden. No music, no advertising screens, just polished brass walls, and the faint smell of money in the air. When the doors opened, I found myself in a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a bank. Leather chairs, art on the walls that looked like it might actually be real, and a receptionist with an appearance that was both friendly and appropriately formidable. "Good morning," she smiled, the kind of smile that told you she was very well paid to always be pleasant. "How may I help you today?" I held up the business card, trying to appear more confident than I felt. "I'd like to see Mr. Victor Sloan." "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "No, but I have account information." I handed her the card with Howard's handwriting on it. Her demeanor changed, just slightly. She didn't become less friendly, but she became much more focused. "Please hold on just a moment." She picked up the phone and spoke very quietly, so quietly I couldn't make out the words, then hung up and looked up at me with another professional smile. "Mr. Sloan will see you right away. Janet will take you in." Janet appeared almost out of nowhere, a woman in her 40s, wearing a suit that I guessed cost about as much as my entire monthly Social Security check. As we moved down the hallway, passing offices where people in immaculate suits were having very serious conversations about numbers that I assumed were very, very large, Janet said, "Mrs. Foster, Mr. Sloan has been expecting you." Had been expecting me? I hadn't even known this place existed until an hour ago. We stopped in front of a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking almost the entire city. Behind a massive mahogany desk, big enough to be a miniature aircraft carrier, sat a man in his 60s, silver-haired, carrying the calm air of someone who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by much. "Mrs. Foster." He stood up so quickly that his chair slid back. "Please, come in, ma'am. May I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" The urgency in his voice startled me a little. This wasn't the polite, distant reception I had braced myself for. Victor Sloan looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time and was still somewhat unsettled that it was finally happening. "I'm fine, thank you," I said, adjusting my wheelchair in front of his desk and pulling out Howard's business card. "I found this among my husband's things. He passed away 3 years ago." Sloan took the card, looked at it for a moment, then raised his eyes to me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mrs. Foster, before we go any further, I need to verify your identity. It's standard procedure for accounts of this nature." Accounts of this nature. What on earth had Howard gotten me into? I handed over my driver's license and Social Security card. Sloan examined them carefully, made copies, then leaned back in his chair, studying me with a gaze that held something like carefully contained amazement. "Mrs. Foster," he finally said, his voice tightly controlled, "you need to see this." Victor Sloan swiveled his computer monitor toward me, and the numbers that appeared on the screen made no sense at all. At first, I assumed there had to be a mistake. Maybe there was an extra zero, or the decimal point was in the wrong place. But as my eyes gradually focused on the account summary, what seemed impossible solidified into an undeniable truth. Howard Benjamin Foster. Current balance, $47,389,724 $1.88. "That can't be right," I whispered. Sloane's face remained gentle, but utterly serious. "Mrs. Foster, your husband maintained this account for 22 years. That figure is accurate." $47 million. My Howard. The man who clipped coupons and drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic until the wheels were practically falling off. The man who always said, "We don't need much as long as we have each other." That man had nearly $50 million in a secret bank account. Do you know what it feels like when your world flips upside down? Not slowly, not gradually, but like someone slapped you straight across the face. I sat there in my wheelchair, in that office with a view of the entire city, and suddenly realized 43 years of marriage had been built on a lie. Every conversation about money, every time we sat down at the table with a budget, every night I lay awake, worrying about how we'd make it through the month. Howard had sat right there, letting me worry, letting me panic, while he had nearly $50 million I knew nothing about. My head was spinning. For a moment, I truly thought I might faint right there in that luxurious office. I don't understand," I finally managed. "Howard was just an accountant. He worked for Henderson Manufacturing for 30 years. We lived paycheck to paycheck our entire lives." "Based on our records," Sloane said, pulling out a thick file, "Mr. Foster was not just an accountant. He served as Henderson Manufacturing's primary financial advisor for over 2 decades. And more importantly, he was an exceptionally gifted investor." The file was full of documents I had never seen before: investment statements, corporate partnership agreements, transaction records spanning more than 20 years. Page after page, line after line of numbers painted the picture of a man I had lived with my entire life, but apparently had never truly known. "At first, everything was quite small," Sloane explained, pointing to the earliest statements. "Your husband brought us his first investment in 2001. $50,000 he had saved from consulting work. He had a very unusual approach to the market, extremely cautious in some areas, and almost unbelievably bold in others." I stared at a document dated 2003 that showed Howard's account already up to $200,000. He had never mentioned any consulting work to me. "And per his instructions, Mrs. Foster," Sloane said, his tone painstakingly careful and respectful, "you were not to be informed of this account unless something happened to him, or you found yourself in what he defined as a truly emergency situation." Truly emergency. "What kind of emergency situation?" I asked. "Financial hardship, medical crisis, family abandonment." He paused noticeably on that last phrase, family abandonment. Howard had somehow anticipated that Damon might turn his back on me. He had created an entire plan for the possibility that one day I would end up alone and desperate. The man who had seemed so simple, so ordinary, so unassuming, had been thinking 20 years ahead, while I was just trying to survive month to month. I suddenly remembered one night, maybe 15 years ago. I lay awake, worrying about the electric bill. We had gone over budget that month, and I had no idea how we were going to cover it. Howard was lying right next to me, breathing steadily. I thought he was asleep. "You okay?" he whispered in the dark. "I'm just worried about money, Howard." He stayed quiet so long I thought he'd drifted off. Then he said, "Everything's going to be okay, Marilyn. I promise." And I believed him. I trusted him. Now I understood. He knew everything would be okay. Because by then, he already had hundreds of thousands of dollars, then gradually millions, in this secret account. But he still let me worry, night after night, year after year. Why, Howard? Why didn't you tell me? If you were me, how would you feel? Relieved because you'd suddenly become rich? Or furious because you realized you'd spent years lying awake over every bill, while the person beside you, the one who said he loved you, had a silent cushion of money tucked away somewhere? This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about trust, about discovering that your life partner has been both your protector and the one who hid half the truth from you. And the next part of the story will show you What will Marilyn do when she suddenly has $47 million in her hands? But a heart that's in pieces? He arranged everything very specifically, Sloan went on, pulling out another document. There is a monthly stipend if you need it. $5,000, transferred into any account you designate. $5,000 a month, while I'd been scraping by on $800 of Social Security. But Mrs. Foster, there is more than that. More? I wasn't sure my heart could take anything more. Your husband didn't just invest his own money, Sloan explained. For years, he identified and funded highly promising business ventures. He owns significant equity in 3 tech companies, 2 restaurants, a small manufacturing firm, and a chain of medical clinics. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Howard owned restaurants. Howard owned medical clinics. Not to mention other holdings, Sloan continued. He had a remarkable eye for undervalued opportunities and a special talent for spotting entrepreneurs who just needed a bit of capital to succeed. His portfolio currently generates around $2 million a year in passive income. $2 million a year, while I was clipping coupons, hunting sales, wearing clothes from thrift stores, sitting there trembling every time the electric bill arrived, weighing every grocery bag to make sure it could last the week. Howard had quietly been earning $2 million a year in profits. Why didn't he tell me? The question slipped out of my mouth as barely more than a whisper. Sloan leaned back in his chair. According to his notes, Mrs. Foster, your husband believed that money can change people. He didn't want it to change your marriage or your relationship with your son. He wanted to live a normal life with the woman he loved, while secretly making sure you would never have to worry about your future. I thought about all the times I'd worried about money, all the nights I'd lain awake, going over every bill, all the little luxuries I forbade myself, all the strain, all the financial anxiety that hung over our marriage. Howard had let me carry all of that, while he sat on $47 million. He was trying to protect you, Sloan said softly, as if reading my thoughts. Protect you from pressure. From the changes money brings to relationships, from people who might try to take advantage of you. People like Damon and Celeste, the ones who treated the concept of family like a business negotiation when they thought you were poor, but would instantly morph into model relatives if they learned you were rich. There's one more thing you need to know, Sloan said, pulling out a final document. Your husband left very clear instructions regarding your son. My heart skipped. What instructions? Damon Foster is not to be informed of this account under any circumstances unless you personally authorize it. Your husband put it in writing very clearly. Sloan looked down at the document and read, My son has demonstrated that he is susceptible to the influence of money and status. Marilyn's estate must be protected from his knowledge of it and from his influence over it until she decides otherwise. And suddenly, I couldn't hold myself together any longer. Tears spilled over. Not tears of joy, not tears of relief, but the tears of a woman who had just realized that her entire life had been built on half a truth. Howard knew. He knew what Damon would do to me. He knew our son measured my value in terms of what I could provide, not who I was, and he had protected me from that truth. Until the exact moment I truly needed protection. But why, Howard? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Why did you let me live with stress, worry, lack, when you could have freed us both with a single sentence? Why did you love me enough to protect me, but not enough to trust me with the whole truth? Sloan gently slid a box of tissues toward me. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, patient, while I cried for the marriage I thought I had, and for the man I now realized I had never fully known. Finally, when I could speak again, I wiped my face and looked up at Victor Sloan. So now, what am I supposed to do? He smiled, for the first time, a truly warm smile since we'd met. Mrs. Foster, now you can do anything you want. You have the means to live any life you choose. The question is no longer what can you do, but what kind of life do you want to live? I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows, down at the city below. I thought of Damon's perfect house, Celeste's fake smile, my empty bank account, and the situation I thought had no way out. 24 hours ago, I was just a burden, begging for scraps of mercy from my own family. And now, I was one of the wealthiest women in the state, and no one, not a single person, knew it. The cab ride home from Harborline Private Finance felt like traveling from one world to another. I clutched the stack of documents on my lap, afraid that if I so much as blinked, it would all disappear, and I'd be back to being a woman in a wheelchair with $237 in the bank and nowhere to go. But the papers were real. The account was real. The $47 million was real, and Howard's deception was real too. When the cab pulled up in front of my house, the shock slowly gave way to anger. Not anger about the money, but anger that for all those years, every budget discussion, every night I worried about bills, Howard had been sitting on a fortune that could have erased all of it. Inside, I spread the documents out on the kitchen table. A clinic called Foster Family Medical Center, a restaurant chain named Maryland's Harbor Kitchen, named after me. And yet he had never mentioned any of it in his lifetime. I opened my laptop and looked them up. Foster Family Medical Center serving low-income families. Maryland's Harbor Kitchen with 18 locations, serving affordable meals. While I had been struggling to pay for my medication, there had been clinics and restaurants tied to our family name out there in the world. And I had never known. The phone rang. It was Damon. "Mom, Celeste and I talked," he said carefully. "We found some senior assistance programs, subsidized housing, stuff that might be a better fit for you." Yesterday, those words might have killed me. Today, with $47 million sitting in front of me, they just sounded absurd. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said calmly. He went on, "You need professional support, Mom. Social workers, case managers, people who understand the system. Celeste found someone named Paula Jenkins who can meet with you tomorrow." "Sounds perfect," I replied. In my mind, there was only one word: comfortable. The whole conversation felt like hearing someone describe moving arrangements for a stranger. After we hung up, I looked at the stack of documents, $47 million, and my son was scheduling a social services appointment so I could apply for subsidized housing. The gap between reality and the way people saw me was almost surreal. I called Harborline back. "Mr. Sloan, I'd like to activate the $5,000 monthly stipend, and I want to ask more about the businesses Howard invested in." He agreed immediately, asked for the account details, then said, "Your husband always believed you were stronger than you think, Mrs. Foster." That night, I ordered the most expensive Chinese food in town and ate it right there at my table, reading through the files. Sweet and sour chicken had never tasted so good, especially knowing I could order it every night for the rest of my life if I wanted to. A text popped up from Celeste. "Marilyn, confirming tomorrow's appointment with Paula Jenkins at 2 p.m. So glad we're able to connect you with the right resources." The right resources. As if I were some case to be handed off to the system, not her mother-in-law. I replied, "Thank you so much. This is exactly what I need." And it was. Not the appointment itself, but a mirror. A clear reflection of how they saw me, poor, helpless, and best handled as someone else's responsibility. The next morning, the doorbell rang at 9:30. A black sedan was parked out front, and a woman in a suit walked up to the porch. "Mrs. Foster, I'm Renee Whitman from Whitman & Associates. I represent some of your late husband's business interests." She stepped into the living room, sat down in Howard's old armchair, opened her briefcase, and laid a thick folder on the table. "For 15 years, I've been the attorney for his investment operations," she said. "He wanted to make sure everything was in order for afterward." Renee asked, "Have you heard of the Foster Foundation?" I shook my head. He founded it 8 years ago. The foundation funds community health programs, low-cost meals, emergency support for families in crisis. It currently holds about $12 million in assets and distributes roughly $800,000 a year. Then she said the next sentence. And per Howard's instructions, you are now the sole trustee of the Foster Foundation. All I could do was stare. Renee continued. Howard had only allowed her to contact me if one of 3 things happened: financial hardship, family abandonment, or signs of being exploited by relatives. He hired a private investigator to periodically check in on your situation, she said. When you were turned away at your son's front door, that triggered the condition he'd set. Howard had been protecting me from beyond the grave, and only now was I realizing how much I had needed that protection. But the next blow was even harsher. Damon currently has about $400,000 in gambling debt, Renee said. He's taken out additional loans against the house and nearly drained their retirement accounts. 2 weeks ago, he contacted several attorneys to ask about the process for declaring an elderly relative legally incompetent, so he could assume control of your assets. The entire room seemed to tilt. Damon didn't just want to simplify emotional complexity. He was actively learning how to legally get his hands on any money he thought I had. Of course he didn't know about Howard's real estate and investments. He was probably only guessing that I had a bit of savings, maybe a small insurance payout. But if that legal process succeeded, he could reach everything. Howard anticipated this possibility, Renee said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in that same familiar handwriting. The letter began, "My dearest Marilyn, if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. Our son has shown who he truly is." He confessed that he felt he had failed as a father, having raised a man who saw people as resources rather than relationships. But he would not let Damon hurt me. Everything he had built, the businesses, the investments, the foundation, belonged to me. He asked me to use them to build the life I deserved, and the final line cut like a knife. If Damon comes at you through legal channels, remember this: the trap is already in place. He just hasn't stepped into it yet. Tears poured down my face. For the husband I loved, for the man I clearly hadn't fully known, for the son who had betrayed me, and for myself. The woman slowly realizing she was nowhere near as weak as everyone seemed to think. "Would you like to hear his plan?" Renee asked quietly. I nodded, and Renee began to tell me about the trap Howard had been quietly constructing for 3 years. A trap designed specifically for Damon, if he ever dared to lay hands on his mother. Renee Whitman spread the documents across the table, speaking like a surgeon presenting the conclusion of an operation that had been prepared years in advance. "Howard's strategy is very simple," she said. "If Damon files a petition to have you declared legally incompetent, all of his debt will be automatically triggered. Every loan, every line of credit in Damon's name had been quietly guaranteed by Howard and tied to the very banks Howard invested in. Total debt, $412,000, not including interest and penalties. If any legal action against me was filed, those guarantees would immediately come due, and the loans could be called in at once. Damon would have 30 days to come up with around $800,000, or he'd lose the house, the car, and his business." Howard had given his son 2 very clear choices: either leave his mother alone and keep his current life, or attack his mother and pull the plug on his own. I looked at the stack of files, my hands trembling, not just because of the numbers, but because I was realizing that the gentle man who had lain beside me for 43 years had been playing a long chess game with our son, and I had never known. Renee pulled out another sheet. If the trap was triggered, I had the right to buy Damon's house at fair market value. "You don't need the house," she said calmly, "but you might enjoy the feeling of evicting the son who abandoned his disabled mother, and then offering to rent it back to him." A very dark part of me agreed. If you're listening to this and wondering, How can a mother sit calmly and listen to a plan that could destroy her own child? The answer is, when that child has turned you into a target, when he's signing papers to strip you of your autonomy and your future, the question is no longer, how do I save him? It becomes, am I finally willing to save myself? At exactly 2 p.m., Paula Jenkins, the social worker Damon had arranged, arrived at my house. Briefcase full of paperwork, a professional smile, tired but kind. "Your son speaks very highly of you," she began. I made coffee, trying to make the kitchen look exactly as expected: old furniture, a few dishes in the sink, an air of making do with very little. Paula explained the Essex County Senior Housing Program, a ground-floor unit, walk-in shower, emergency call system. The rent would be about 30% of my Social Security income, around $240 a month. Yesterday, it would have sounded like a lifeline. Today, all I could hear was, "This is where your son thinks you belong." "There's a waiting list," Paula said, "but I can help move you up. Maybe 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks for Damon to tell everyone he had found the right resources for Mom. She lowered her voice and asked, "Your son cares, but he seems a bit distant. Is everything okay in your family?" "Damon has his own family," I replied. "I understand I can't be his top priority." "But you're still his mother," she said gently. "Being someone's mother," I looked at her, "doesn't automatically guarantee that person will sacrifice for you, does it?" Paula's eyes dimmed a little. She understood more than I expected. We filled out forms for almost an hour. Before she left, she said, "This isn't the end of your independence. For many people, it's a new beginning." I nodded. She had no idea how right she was, just not in the way she imagined. After Paula left, I sat in the kitchen between two worlds. On one side, the application forms for subsidized housing. On the other, files about the Foster Foundation, Foster Family Medical Center, and Maryland's Harbor Kitchen, the things Howard had built to help strangers. My husband used money to save people. My son used me to save himself. My phone buzzed. Damon was calling. "How did it go with Paula, Mom?" "Very well. She found exactly what I need." Damon exhaled in relief, then quickly moved on to what really mattered. "Celeste and I think we should be more involved in your transition plan. You'll have to make some financial decisions, closing accounts, liquidating assets. It'll be easier if we help you." Liquidating assets. He had already started reaching out his hand, not knowing that behind me stood $47 million. "That's very thoughtful," I said evenly, "but I think I can handle my own money." "Mom, with all due respect, you've never been good with finances. Dad always took care of everything. Now that you're older, one bad decision and it could all be gone." He suggested a very good financial advisor, all set and ready, someone who would just need a few signed powers of attorney from me. "I don't think that's necessary right now, Damon," I cut in gently. "At least promise you won't make any major financial decisions without talking to us first, okay?" "I promise I'll be very careful with my money," I said. And this time, I was telling the truth. I was going to protect those $47 million, first and foremost, from my own son. The next morning, at 10:15, Renee called. "It's done, Mrs. Foster. At 9:45, Damon filed a petition with the court to have your mental competence evaluated. The preliminary hearing is set for next Friday." He had pulled the trigger. "Debt acceleration notices will go out as soon as the court processes the filing," Renee went on. "Damon's creditors will have 30 days to demand payment. His mortgage could be called in as early as this afternoon." The plan Howard had spent 3 years constructing was finally in motion. Damon had tried to strip me of my freedom and dignity. In exchange, he was about to lose everything he believed he deserved. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and scream, "Stop while you still can!" But another part of me understood perfectly. Some lessons can only be learned by letting it hurt. "Anything else I should know, Ms. Whitman?" "Yes. Damon told the court you've been making erratic financial decisions, talking about money you don't have. He used yesterday's $5,000 withdrawal as evidence. $5,000, the first transfer from Howard's account. To him, it looked exactly like a reckless spending spree by an old woman who didn't know what she was doing. "He has no idea what's waiting for him, does he?" I asked quietly. "He has no idea," Renee replied. "He's playing asset grab chess against the man who designed the board." "What do I need to do now?" "Nothing. Just let everything proceed. Just be prepared. Things are going to get very ugly for a while." She wasn't wrong. By 2 p.m., Damon had called 4 times. The voicemails grew more frantic. "Mom, something crazy is going on with my mortgage. The bank says they need to reassess the terms immediately. Please call me back. This is urgent." I didn't call back. At 4:30, Celeste called. Damon was in a financial meltdown. There might be some court-related issue. They needed to see me immediately. I didn't answer her either. At 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Through the little window, I saw Damon's car at the curb, and Damon and Celeste standing on the porch, faces pale. Damon looked like he hadn't slept all night. Celeste's glossy, calm exterior had cracked, letting raw panic show through. I opened the door, but I didn't invite them in. "Mom, we need to talk." Damon's voice was already breaking on the first sentence. I didn't open the door any wider, just kept my hand on the knob. "Mom, something's very wrong with my loans," he stammered. "All the banks, all the lenders, they're demanding immediate payment. They say Dad co-signed guarantees for over $400,000. That can't be right, can it? Did he ever mention that to you?" "Your father handled all the finances," I replied. "I rarely knew what he was doing with investments and business arrangements." Celeste stepped forward, her face tight. "Marilyn, this is very serious. If those guarantees are real, we could lose everything. The house, the cars, all of it." "I'm very sorry to hear that." "Very sorry?" Celeste almost snapped. "If Damon loses the house, where exactly do you plan on living when you can't take care of yourself?" Yesterday, I had been too much of a burden to sleep on their couch for a week. Today, I had become part of their long-term housing plan. "I think I'll manage," I said calmly. Damon stared at me, bewildered. "Did you hire a lawyer, Mom? Someone filed an objection to my petition for a competence hearing, and they know my finances in detail." "I'm represented by Whitman and Associates." "Whitman and Associates?" Damon almost shouted. "They charge $500 an hour. How can you afford them?" $500 an hour is a very reasonable rate to protect $47 million. Celeste lost patience. "Whatever you're playing at, it needs to stop. Damon was trying to help you, and now that has triggered a full-blown financial nightmare. You have to fix this." "Fix it how, Celeste?" "Call the lawyer, withdraw the filings, and we'll sort this out together like adults." As if filing to have your own mother declared incompetent so you can access her accounts was an act of maturity. "Mom, are you saying you're not going to help me with these loans?" Damon asked. "I'm saying," I replied slowly, "that you should have thought about consequences before choosing to declare your disabled mother incompetent just to crawl into her bank accounts." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. The sweet, easily manipulated woman they were used to was gone. "That's not what this was, Mom," Damon stammered. "Then what was it?" "I just wanted to protect you from bad financial decisions. You're vulnerable." "You're right," I nodded. "An old, disabled woman is very easy to exploit. Fortunately, your father planned for that possibility." Celeste panicked. "What do you mean, planned for it?" "I mean your father was very smart, and he understood exactly what kind of man his son might become." For the first time in 3 days, I shut the door in their faces and left them standing on the porch. Tomorrow they would find out just how smart Howard really was. If at this point you feel torn, unsure whether to feel sorry for Damon or for Marilyn, that's normal, because somewhere inside each of us, there's a part like Damon, the part that chooses whatever is easiest for ourselves and calls it reasonable. And there's a part like Marilyn, the part that endures too long, is too gentle, too afraid of disappointing everyone. But at some point, the question stops being, how bad is that other person? And becomes, am I willing to stop saving the person who keeps abandoning me so I can finally save myself? The next morning, I received the most satisfying phone call of my life. Mrs. Foster, very good news, Renee said. At 8 a.m., First National Bank began foreclosure proceedings on Damon's house. His auto loans have been called in, and consolidated notices for his gambling debts went out to all creditors last night. How much time does he have? 14 days to pay, or repossession begins. Roughly $870,000 in total. Money Damon did not have, and could not possibly raise in 2 weeks. Howard's trap had sprung, working exactly as designed. There's more, Renee continued. Damon's attorney withdrew from the case this morning due to a conflict of interest. It's hard to petition to have someone declared incompetent while simultaneously owing them close to $1 million. The hearing has been postponed indefinitely. Your son's case is essentially dead. I felt a deep, almost sacred sense of satisfaction. Damon tried to steal my freedom and dignity. In return, he lost everything. The doorbell rang at 10:30. This time Damon came alone, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. Mom, please, can we talk? I let him in. I wanted to hear what he'd say now that everything had burned down. You have every right to be mad, he said, sitting as if afraid to jostle an invisible bomb. But Mom, I'm losing everything. The house, the business, everything I've built. That must be terrifying. It is, he choked out. I don't even understand how Dad set this up. Did he plan this? Did he know I'd try to have you declared incompetent so you could steal from your mother? Damon flinched. It's not stealing. I really was worried about you. When were you worried about me? I asked. When you wouldn't let me sleep on your couch for a week? When Celeste suggested I should be grateful for subsidized housing? Or only from the moment you smelled money? Images of Damon flashed through my mind. Damon at 5 clutching my leg, Damon at 12 holding his science trophy, Damon at 18 crying in Howard's hospital room. When did he change? Or had I simply refused to see it? That's not fair, Damon tried to protest. You want to talk about fair? I laughed softly. Fine. Let me tell you about fair. I rolled into Howard's office, took the Harbor Line private finance statements, and laid them on the table. Your father left me $47 million, Damon. 47 million? His face went chalk white. It took him 22 years to build that, while I worried about every grocery bill. He did it so I would never have to depend on people who might not actually put me first. I spread out more documents, medical funds, the restaurant chain, business partnerships worth several more millions. Mom, I didn't know. If I'd known, I would have. If you'd known what? You would have been kinder to me? Let me sleep on your couch? Treated me like family instead of a burden? Damon grabbed his head. I'm sorry. I know I'm wrong, but please, you have to help me. I'm about to lose everything. I looked at my son and realized I wasn't angry anymore, and I no longer felt the instinct to protect him. All that was left was clarity. This is who he really is. Damon, I said, your father spent 3 years setting this up. Every guarantee, every loan clause was designed to give you a choice. Treat your mother with basic respect and keep what you have, or attack her legally and lose everything. But I didn't know. You didn't need to know. You just needed to do one simple thing. Be a decent son. He started crying, his voice cracking. Mom, I'll do anything. I'll take care of you, move you in with us. I'll be the son you deserve. Just help me out of this. Do you know what I'm going to do with your father's money? He looked up, still clinging to hope. I'm going to expand the medical fund, open more restaurants for working families. I'm going to help people who've been abandoned the way I was, by their own families. What about me? I'm your son. I'm your family. I rolled closer and looked him straight in the eye. Damon, yesterday, when I needed help, you were also my son. But today, when you need help, I've learned something from the way you treated me. What? That family is a very complicated matter. That afternoon, I told Renee to let the foreclosures and repossessions proceed exactly as Howard had planned. I also instructed her to go ahead and purchase Damon's house at fair market value. A week later, the locks were changed, and Damon and Celeste's belongings were moved into storage. I hired none other than Paula Jenkins, the same woman who had once come to my house to help me apply for senior housing, to transform that house into transitional housing for abandoned seniors. Damon's dream home was now a shelter for people whose children had decided it was more efficient to let the system deal with them. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office at the Foster Foundation, reviewing grant applications and planning the expansion of Maryland's Harbor Kitchen. The foundation now provided emergency aid to families in crisis, medical support for the elderly, and operated 3 transitional homes for seniors abandoned by their children. My phone buzzed. Another text from Damon. Mom, Ashley left me. I'm in a tiny studio, working 2 jobs to make minimum payments. I know I messed up, but I'm your son. Please call me. I deleted the message, just as I had all the others before it. I had understood something. Being a mother is biology. Being family is about choices, respect, and mutual care. Damon had been my son for 38 years, but he had never truly been my family. Paula knocked on the door, smiling. Mrs. Foster, we have a new application for the transitional housing program. Of course. Come in. 71-year-old woman. Accident left her in a wheelchair. Her son tried to have her declared incompetent to control her finances. Her name is Dorothy Martinez, from Newark. She has nowhere else to go. I looked at her picture, tired eyes, frightened, but with a faint spark of hope, exactly like me 6 months ago. When can she move in? If you approve her, next week. Approved. And tell her this, from now on, she's not alone. That night, I sat in Howard's old office, the room that had become my favorite place in the house. In the bottom drawer, I found an envelope with his familiar handwriting, to be opened when you've found yourself again. In the letter, Howard admitted he'd kept the secret because he was afraid of losing me, afraid that money would distort love and turn everything into a transaction. He acknowledged it was a mistake, that he should have trusted me, should have shared the truth. But he also wrote that this mistake had accidentally become a gift, because if I had known about the money earlier, maybe I never would have discovered just how strong I really was, never would have learned that I didn't need anyone, not even him, to survive. He asked me to use the money to build something meaningful, to help people who were strong but didn't know it yet, people who deserved more than they'd been given. And at the end, he reminded me that every decision he made, right or wrong, had come from love. I sat there and let the tears fall, but this time, not from anger or betrayal, but from understanding and forgiveness. Howard wasn't perfect, but he had loved me in his own way, and he had accidentally given me the one gift I hadn't known I needed, the chance to meet the strongest version of myself. The funny thing about rock bottom is, it's the only place you can push off from. 8 months ago, I sat in my wheelchair on my son's doorstep, convinced I had lost everything. Turns out, I had to lose everything, to find what I'd always had, the ability to stand up for myself. I had to lose my old house to build a different kind of home, lose the son I thought I had to understand that family isn't about blood, but about choice. Lose my illusions about my marriage to realize that real love can be flawed and still be genuine. And most importantly, I had to lose everything to learn that strength isn't about never falling. It's about learning how to get back up. Today, I sit in an office bearing the Foster name, helping people who are just like the woman I used to be. My phone buzzes again, another message from Damon. I look at it for a few seconds, then delete it. Maybe someday, I'll be ready to listen. Maybe someday Damon will truly learn the lesson Howard spent 3 years preparing for him. But today is not that day. Today, there are people who need my help, and a life I still intend to live fully. Because the 69-year-old woman in a wheelchair that even I once believed was weak and dependent never actually existed. I had always been strong. I just needed to lose everything, to finally believe that about myself. And if you've listened this far and feel your own family doesn't see you, if you're wondering whether you still have any worth, remember this: you are stronger than you think. You deserve more than the way others treat you. And sometimes the best thing that ever happens to you is losing the people who kept convincing you that you were nothing. Because only when you're standing alone do you finally see you're still standing.